So I would like to invite first speaker, Professor Aaron Benavot, State University, New York. He made all the way through from United States. Professor Aaron Benavot is very well-known international figure in global citizen education and peace education. He is involved with the United Nations and UNESCO program for a long time, and it will be our great pleasure to welcome him. Okay. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. So the person that I had to convince to be able to come and speak before you was my wife, who hails from China and who was obviously very concerned about coming to this particular part of the world. But I felt that it was incumbent upon me to speak to such an honored community. So thank you very much for this invitation. Distinguished colleagues, I indeed have I come as a social scientist. Most of my career has been doing cross-national comparisons of education systems. And at some point, I decided to take a leap into the unknown and start working in an international organization that many of you have heard of, UNESCO, the UN specialized organization that looks at education, culture, science, and communication. And it was in this meeting of moving from academia into the world of international policy that I came to know a little bit about international policy discourse in the areas that are of interest to us today, which is peace education and global citizenship education. I have prepared, which is incumbent upon an academic, a much longer series of slides than I will have the opportunity to discuss. But you have in front of you a pamphlet that describes many of the slides that I prepared. So to the extent that you are interested in my remarks, please take this as an invitation to look at these slides a little bit further. I have organized my presentation in 6 different sections. The first is to talk about the challenge that universities face in addressing the question of peace education and global citizenship education, to talk briefly about the changing roles and missions of higher education institutions. Thirdly, to briefly mention some of the major changes that have occurred at the higher education sector from a global perspective. And then we get into the 2, in some sense, weightier sections. One that looks at the opportunities that have emerged in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development around the area of peace education and global citizenship education, and indeed, what are the links between higher education and some of these opportunities. So let me first say that unlike perhaps some of the other people that will speak about the wonderful impact of education in general and universities in particular, I would prefer to talk about higher education as embodying many different contradictions, many different opposing forces and tensions that many institutions of higher education hold within it. And the international community has always had a somewhat ambivalent attitude toward the investment in higher education. For many decades, the World Bank and OECD and many other donor countries were unwilling or very reluctant to provide funding to countries in the developing world and the global south for the expansion of higher education. And in fact, it's only been in the last, let's say, 15 years, and really in the last decade, that policy has changed. And partly it was based on evidence that showed that the rate of return, the social and economic rate of return to investment in higher education was much lower than the rate of return to, let's say, primary and secondary education. So from a complete, let's call it, cost-benefit analysis, it was much more effective to basically consult or suggest to countries that they should put most of their investment, especially some of the scarce resources that they had, in expanding opportunities at the primary and secondary level. But education at the higher level is also considered to be a pillar of human rights. If you go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see mention of higher education, equitable access to higher education as a basic human right. And irrespective of all the kinds of backgrounds that people might have. And meanwhile, over the last 4 or 5 decades, as you'll see in just a moment, enrollments in higher education from a global level have expanded dramatically, especially since the 1990s. And many have been, much of this interest in higher education has occurred with this shifting discourse around the knowledge-based economies, the global competition among different countries, around the generation and creation of new knowledge based on a different kind of capital than the capital of decades and centuries before. So now we need skilled labor forces that are information savvy, that can create new sources of value. And so universities will be the place in which these new, this kind of human capital, these pools of information-rich and savvy, skilled workers would be produced. So the point, though, is that if you look at the evidence, it is not necessarily the case that those countries that have expanded access to higher education have necessarily seen the bounty, the fruitful impact of this in terms of their economic growth. Korea is a good example in which this link seems to be very strong. The question is whether or not the ROC is an exception to the rule or part of a broader general pattern. And there are many who would argue that it's more an exception than the rule. And so there are many instances in which regimes of a particular political persuasion have mobilized universities in support of very particular political and other social aims that have nothing to do with economic growth and development. And so here we begin to see some of these contradictions that I wish to point out. And despite all this, at the international level, and in particular in the last 5 years with the emergence of the Sustainable Development Agenda, there has been this renewed interest in higher education. Up until 2015, the international education community, in all the key documents that drove international education policy, made almost no mention about universities and higher education. The only role for higher education up until, let's say, 2015 was in training teachers who would support the expansion of basic education and make it universal in various parts of the global south. So it's important to see that universities can be seen both as a positive and potentially a more problematic impact on the possibilities for development in different countries. And therefore, I think it's important to take a much more realistic view about the potential impact of universities in the areas that we're looking at, which is peace education and global citizenship education. And in fact, the way that I would try to formulate the challenge would be, to what extent can countries, or for that matter, particular institutions, navigate these contradictions in higher education in order to advance peace education and global citizenship education. Acknowledging the contradictions is important in order to address in some realistic and important way the aim to try to promote peace and global citizenship. Now, part of the problem is also that the roles of higher education have changed. Traditionally, most universities were in the business of, first of all, creating a cadre of leaders, of elites, that would take over positions of political, economic, and social leadership in the countries in which they live. We were talking about a very small slice of each cohort. They would allocate people into the labor market especially into positions of high reputation, income, and power. And they were involved in developing research and implementing new scientific truths. But what we see now emerging in the last decade are new roles for higher education. And partly these have to do with the promotion of public-private partnerships, of developing a mechanism for local and regional development, looking to foster various kinds of technological innovations that might have economic dividends. And many universities now have opened up patent offices, and having graduated from Stanford, I can tell you how much Stanford University made incredible, huge amounts of money based on the patents that they were able to develop in their engineering in some of the other schools, which has then served their endowment over a long period of time. So what we see is that in many ways, the new roles that universities have taken on often have a very economic, instrumental perspective involved. And in some ways, this makes it even more difficult to, let's say, mobilize universities and institutions of higher education for the promotion of such humanistic endeavors such as peace and global citizenship. So here we see another kind of tension. Okay. So let me just kind of briefly mention some of the key changes that have occurred from a global perspective with respect to universities and the higher education sector. First of all, it has been growing at almost an exponential rate. The numbers of enrollments now at the global level, according to the most recent figures, is 223 million people around the world who are registered in one of the institutions of higher education over the 200 different countries and systems that exist. This has more than doubled the number of enrollments that existed in the year 2000. And we see that even also the proportion of women in those enrollments has increased, and now they are about half. This is true both at the undergraduate and increasingly at the MA and PhD levels. There are 10 systems of higher education that make up about 60% of all the global enrollments. They're the big 10. You can see them listed here: China, India, the US, the Russian Federation, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, Iran, Turkey, and the Republic of Korea. That has not changed very dramatically, but there are very few students still in the low-income countries of the world. Most of the expansion in higher education in the last 2 decades has occurred in middle-income countries. Many of the smallest countries in the world, because higher education is so expensive, are sending their young people to other countries to get an education. So you can see here, although this is a little bit difficult to look at this map, but some of the poorest and smallest countries are the ones that are most colored here, because they're the ones that find it very difficult to develop a system of higher education. And if you take a look, these are the lines of expansion. This is what's known as the gross enrollment ratio. This is the proportion of people basically between the ages of 18 and 22 who are enrolled in higher education institutions in different regions of the world. You will notice that except for North America, which is made up of the US, Canada, and Bermuda, most of the rest of the world is fairly flat in the levels of expansion that occurred in the 1970s, the 1980s, and really we see the upturn ticking up around 1995. So the expansion that has occurred in most parts of the world, the middle income and to some extent the upper middle income, is occurring basically in the last 20 years, and significantly so, and especially as you can even see here in East Asia and the Pacific, very dramatic increases in the last 5 years. The strange loop that occurs up in North America, by the way, is that the international agencies have a very particular way in which they classify enrollments in institutions of higher education, and there have been 2 changes in those classification schemes. This is known as the International Standardized Classification of Educational Development, ISCED, and in 1995 and then in 2011, there were 2 different changes that had an impact on which students in which kinds of institutions were being counted as part of the higher education sector. So now there's a new category of post-secondary, non-tertiary, which is one of the reasons why it drops there at some point. The other important part of the development of higher education in the last few years has been its privatization. A third of all the enrollments, even more so probably if we looked at the most recent figures, are now in institutions that are either privately funded or privately governed. About a third of all the enrollments in the world are in private institutions of higher education. And according to my colleague, Daniel Levy, who's an expert in this area, approximately 98% of all the systems in the world now include both public and private institutions of higher education. That's a fairly astonishing change too. So one of the conditions for the expansion of higher education in the last 2 decades, and partly as a reflection of the ambivalence of international agencies toward investing in higher education, has been its privatization, has been the providing opportunities for private sources of funding to establish institutions and allow for the demand to take hold. We're going to skip over this. The other important thing to keep in mind, which will not surprise any of you, is that as universities expand, they tap into very particular parts of the youth age cohorts, which is to say that it's typically the more advantaged, those children or young people who come from more advantaged backgrounds, who are able to take advantage of the opportunities and come into universities. So here we see the green dots are those enrollments or those children who come from the richest quintile households, and the ones in yellow. And we can see as countries in some sense expand their systems of higher education, the social economic inequalities in terms of who has access also begin to increase. Although we also see that countries differ in terms of the extent to which these inequalities can be found. And there's lots of different stories around public policy and the extent to which opportunities are made available to those young people who have the sufficient kind of wherewithal to study in universities, are given the opportunities to do so with support of the state. Women now make up about more than half of all university students. This is especially true in middle and high income countries. They are still a minority in enrollments in lower income countries. Okay, I'm going to skip over a lot of slides here because I see my time is not going to allow me to go too far here. Okay, so now I shift to this new window that's opened up, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And most of you have seen these kinds of slides. I'm sure my colleague will also talk a little bit about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I wish to focus on one particular target in one of the goals, which is the goal on education, SDG 4, and the target is known as Target 4.7. It is the target that speaks about education for sustainable development and education for global citizenship. And it's this target that includes, for the first time, the importance at the international level, the importance of all the things that are related to, let's say, the moral, humanistic purposes of education. And as you can see, by 2030, the target says, ensure that all learners, notice it does not differentiate only those that are in school, acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace, global citizenship, and an appreciation of cultural diversity and the culture's contribution to sustainable development. Everything but the kitchen sink was included in this target. And you might say, how in heaven's name did they bring together all these wonderful ideas? And in fact, doing an archaeology of each of the different terms that are noted here in Target 4.7 is actually very important, because each of these terms has a history in international policy discourse. Some of them are much older, like human rights education or the promotion of a culture of peace. Some of them are much more recent, like ESD or global citizenship. Each of them, and if you look at some of the slides that I prepared, you can see some of the roots of each of these different terms in international education discourse and in agreements and statements that were agreed upon by, in particular, UNESCO member states or by member states of the United Nations over the course of the last few decades. So on the one hand, and by the way, it also speaks to an important paragraph in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Usually the paragraph people do not remember because it's the first paragraph that talks about universal primary education and equal access to higher education. It's the second paragraph that speaks about the content and goals of education and speaks about the importance of strengthening human rights and fundamental freedoms, promoting understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations, racial and religious groups, and shall further the activities of the UN and the maintenance of peace. These notions go back 70 years. So it's important to keep in mind that each of these topics under Target 4.7 many of them have very long pedigree and historical roots. But the problem is that many of them overlap in many of the issues that they are interested in. And in some ways that is part and parcel the vision of this new agenda, which is a holistic, integrated, intertwined agenda in which you don't try to work within separate silos, but try to work across silos, across the SDGs, and even within SDG 4, across the different targets. Now the question then becomes, how do we assess the extent to which countries are making real progress with respect to their commitment? 196 countries signed off on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, almost every country in the world. And they agreed upon each of these different targets, and 2 years later, they also agreed upon the global indicators. There are two forms of accountability in the UN system currently. One is called voluntary national reviews that many countries have been preparing and submitting to the UN based on various kinds of templates. And the other is an indicator framework that has evolved over time, but in particular, the global indicators that I just want to mention in just a moment. Approximately 140 countries have submitted. Some of them have done so twice, these voluntary national reviews. It's very interesting to read these national reviews. They are a little bit more eye-opening than you might expect because they're meant to provide some sense of what are the challenges that many of the countries are facing. I had the opportunity to work with the Vietnamese Ministry of Education about a year ago, and we read very carefully the Vietnamese Voluntary National Review, which was quite enlightening. But most of the attention has been on the global indicator for Target 4.7, and notice what it asks countries to collect information about. The extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, including gender equality and human rights, are mainstreamed at all levels in 4 different areas: in national education policies, in curricula, in teacher education, and in student assessment. This is where the real business of the 2030 Agenda is taking place. The extent to which countries can demonstrate that they are mainstreaming each of those different topics and concepts in Target 4.7 in policies, curricula, which I would include textbooks, student assessments, and in teacher education. Here, the evidence is lacking. Here we have all the kind of methodological challenges that you might imagine are numerous. We have very little international surveys that look at these issues systematically, that compile evidence about country progress. If you look at UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, there's almost no information about Target 4.7, and certainly with respect to this global indicator. So this is where the real challenge. So on the one hand, we have one of the most important, historically without precedent, target. This is the first time that we have a target that speaks to the moral, social, and humanistic purposes of education, that looks at education not just in terms of foundational skills and in terms of skills for the economy, but talks about education in terms of the broader issues that really brought us together for this conference. But on the other hand, the measurement and monitoring challenges are enormous. And I do not see on the horizon any easy solutions, as it were. And I've been in the business now for quite a bit of time. So there are various opportunities. There are some interesting surveys that have that look at adults and sometimes at university students in terms of their knowledge about some of these issues, but they're often one-off kinds of surveys. The global coverage of these surveys is quite limited. Many of them are mainly done in high-income countries. UNESCO has decided in its own, I would say, convoluted approach to use a survey instrument that harkens back to a recommendation going back to 1974, and they send a survey instrument to each of the national commissions of UNESCO, asking them to collect information about the extent to which those countries are mainstreaming in each of the 4 areas, the aspects of Target 4.7. The information they get back is very shoddy, very uneven in terms of quality, and what they end up coming up with is something like a heat chart. So if you are green, then you're doing a good job. If you're yellow, then it's cautionary. And if you're red, that means you're doing poorly. And how effective or informative this is for policymakers. By the way, if I showed you the information for South Korea, you would be astounded that it actually is both yellow and red in the area in which the Koreans have enormous commitments. So it begins to demonstrate the extent to which the measurement instrument does not align well with the actual intent of the target. So there's a lot of problems here. They're trying to work out, let's say, some of the wrinkles, but I do not foresee this being the best way forward. But there are other sources of evidence. Some of them my team that I directed in Paris some years ago. We worked with the International Bureau of Education, which is located in Geneva, originally established by Jean Piaget back in the 20s, the oldest international government organization on education. They have the best archive of textbooks and lots of information about national curricular frameworks. We did content analysis of these things, and you can see based on the content analysis of these national curricular frameworks for about 80 countries that issues around peace, although not necessarily peace education, and issues around globalization and multiculturalism are fairly prevalent, whereas the notion of, let's say, global citizenship, less so, and certainly global inequality or global local thinking is much less so. So you see the different terms turn up in different ways in different national curricula, but all of this speaks more to the intentions, the intended policies, and tell us less about what actually happens in classrooms and the kind of pedagogy that's being implemented by teachers in schools. Recently, my colleagues also carried out a 10-country study that we analyzed different documents from the policy world and also the curricular policy world, looking at issues of global citizenship education and ESD, and we found some very interesting findings, partly because we were interested in trying to disentangle a very important distinction between 3 different dimensions of learning: the cognitive, the social emotional, and the behavioral. The argument that UNESCO has put forward in many of its documents is that the most effective kind of global citizenship education and ESD is one in which each of these three learning dimensions are fairly well balanced, so that the best learning takes place when learning includes all three dimensions and doesn't, as it were, advantage one over the other. And when we looked at it, we saw that GCD, for example, has a much greater emphasis overall on social and emotional learning, less so on cognitive and very little on behavioral, whereas Education for Sustainable Development puts much more emphasis on the cognitive relative to the social, emotional, and the sustainable. So let me now conclude, because of very limited time here. I'm going to move very quickly, and I apologize, but I'll give you an opportunity to read through the slides at your leisure. First, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are no best practices that are necessarily relevant for all institutions of higher education and for each university. Much of what matters depends on context and on history of the institution. And so what I've listed here are ideas that university presidents or other university leaders might consider to the extent to which they would like to provide a fertile ground or platform that would promote interest in peace education or global citizenship education. Many of these things I'm sure that you have thought of, or you and your staff have thought of. Things like supporting interdisciplinary programs, internationalizing the content of courses and curricular programs, providing for study abroad, diversifying the faculty, prioritizing sustainability in a whole institutional perspective. Redesigning some of the extension programs that you make available that are not just focused on agriculture and, let's say, and some ideas around what crops should be grown or what seed should be used, but are used also to improve literacy skills and empower local communities to become much more involved in governing their own affairs. Recognizing and validating the indigenous knowledge and practices, offering courses for the training of teachers in local languages, and providing expertise, as I've indicated, a big challenge, expertise in areas that go undervalued around Target 4.7 and many of the issues that I've put forward here. So universities, in my view, should play a leading role in addressing many of the pressing challenges that we have heard quite extensively in the previous session. But it's important for us to recognize the many contradictions that are embodied in many universities and in higher education sectors. We need to navigate these contradictions if indeed we are to find conditions that would promote peace education and global citizenship education. And finally, I see the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as an enormous window of opportunity that really has no historical precedent, certainly in the area of education. It is the most comprehensive, it is the most ambitious, it is the most universalistic agenda that has ever been conceived, and therefore it provides an opportunity, and the question is, are we going to take this opportunity and make good use of it in the next decade? Thank you so much for your attention.